If you've heard the name Elizabeth Blackwell, you undoubtedly know that she was the first woman to achieve an MD degree in the United States. If that were her only breakthrough, she would deserve a prominent place in the history of medicine and the history of women's rights. But I've got news for you. When she was awarded that degree from Geneva Medical College in 1849, she was just getting warmed up. There's more, a lot more. Let's get started. Elizabeth Blackwell was born in 1821 in Bristol, England. She was the third daughter in a family of 9 children. They were religious. They were abolitionists. The children were educated at home by a governess, and her father owned a sugar refining business. Interestingly, in a move to express support of the abolitionist movement, the children gave up eating sugar, the product of slavery. When Elizabeth was 11, the family sailed for America and settled first in New York and then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, in pursuit of business opportunities. Within months of arriving in Ohio, her father died, leaving the once comfortable middle-class family penniless. The girls began taking in students, and the older boys took jobs at the courthouse. A friend, who was dying of uterine cancer, told Elizabeth that her suffering with her illness would have been much more bearable had her physician been a woman, and encouraged Elizabeth to become a doctor. Elizabeth, saying that she was repulsed by everything connected with the body, and saying that she could not bear the sight of a medical book, initially said that this was out of the question. But she saw herself as needing to champion a bigger cause, and to provide a barrier between herself and an ordinary married life, which she did not feel suited to. She eventually decided that entering the medical profession would be that cause. This was in 1845. Medicine at that time was not the selective or prestigious profession that it is today. Most doctors did not have an MD degree in the United States. Most did apprenticeships, and some just hung out their shingle. Farmers sent their sons to medical school if they were no good around the farm. But these were not the standards that Elizabeth saw as necessary. She was not only going to enter the profession, she was going to elevate it. Her approach, which stood her in good stead for her lifetime, was to meet with friends and friends of friends who could help her and build connections. She won over even the skeptical by her drive and intelligence, but most ended up telling her that her quest was impossible. She was undeterred. In fact, she said that their verdict was an encouragement. This moral fight possessed an immense attraction for her. Indeed, at the time, the only woman referred to as a female physician was an abortionist in New York City. This repulsed her Victorian sensibilities and filled her with determination. Boarding first with a doctor in Asheville, North Carolina, and later with one in Charleston, South Carolina, she taught in schools that they ran, earned money for medical school, and was taught anatomy and physiology by the sympathetic doctors. At the time, Philadelphia was the center of medicine in the United States. She moved there in 1847 and boarded with a physician who was encouraging to her. She attended anatomy lectures, but was not able to gain admission to any of the 4 Philadelphia schools. She did, however, expand her list of contacts. Advice she received ranged from going to Paris, where medicine was taught in public forums, to disguising herself as a man to gain admission to local schools. But this was, in her words, a moral crusade, and must be pursued in the light of day. After being turned down by all schools in Philadelphia and in New York City, she obtained a list of schools in all northern states and applied to a dozen. The authorities at Geneva Medical College, reluctant to reject her based only on her gender, put it to the students to vote on her admission. The students were a rollicking bunch, classes often so loud that the professor could not be heard, and neighbors complaining repeatedly of the boisterous noise and behavior. They, thinking that this might be a joke, voted her in. Within 2 days of receiving her acceptance letter, she arrived in Geneva. She had secured a room at a boarding house and was in class. Picture, if you will, a small riot taking place in a lecture hall. the door opening and a petite Victorian woman walking determinedly to a seat at the front, sitting down and carefully putting her hat under her chair, all the time ignoring the howls and pieces of paper drifting her way. The room grew silent. Order was restored. Nothing was going to shift her focus. Her notes were meticulous. Her performance was exemplary. A professor who sought to exclude her from a class, revealing a particularly delicate bit of anatomy, got a note from her explaining how important it was for him to ensure that all his students were knowledgeable. She would never want him to shirk his duties. She was admitted to the class. After spending a summer gaining clinical experience in Philadelphia at the Blackwell Almshouse, assigned to the women's syphilis ward, she returned to Geneva to complete her studies. Ironically and perhaps revealing of her Victorian sensibilities, she later noted that it was not until 1869 that her mind comprehended the activity that led to the syphilis of her patients. Back in Geneva, she readied for graduation in January of 1849. She refused to participate in a procession through town to the church where the graduation was held, since she felt that it would not be ladylike. Last to receive her diploma, she was declared first in her class. Done, right? Mission accomplished? Not quite. By her standards, a medical degree was not enough to ready her for practice, and she began a period of further clinical study. She initially returned to Philadelphia for more lectures, but felt the need to learn what England and Europe had to offer, and departed for England shortly afterward. She was greeted in England as a physician and treated to access to clinics and operating rooms. Indeed, after witnessing an amputation without anesthesia, this person who had previously said that everything connected with the body was repulsive, now determined to become the first woman surgeon. After an initial stint in England, she departed for France, then a center of medicine in the world. Her greeting there was quite a contrast from England. Doctors refused to accept her credentials, and she was told that she must begin training at the maternity hospital, where she could train as a midwife. Midwives at that time were otherwise uneducated and at the bottom of the medical totem pole. If that what was offered, that's what she would take. She spent several months there, confined to the hospital property. At the maternity, while irrigating the eye of an infected infant, she splashed water in her eye and became infected herself. Out of concern and perhaps out of guilt, she was showered with the best medical care that Paris could provide. This included cauterizing her eyelids, leeches to the temple, opium to the forehead, cold compresses, ointment of belladonna, purgatives, foot baths, black mustard plasters, hourly irrigations. She remained in bed for 3 weeks, but emerged blind in one eye. Her response? Fate has certainly given me a blow, but I am up again, strong, hopeful, and eager to work. However, when it sank in that she could not do surgical work or read, what followed were 6 months of mental suffering. She had to abandon her plans to become a surgeon. Interestingly, in 1850, she receives communication regarding the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her response may surprise some today. She said, "I cannot sympathize with an anti-man movement. I've had too much kindness, aid, and just recognition from men. I think that the true end of freedom may be gained another way. The great object of education has nothing to do with women's rights or men's rights, but with the development of the human soul and body." In 1853, she returned to the U.S. and settled in New York City. Care in those days could take place in doctors' offices, homes, or home visits. For the poor, there were dispensaries for outpatient care and infirmaries, which were the hospitals of the time. The local medical establishment wanted nothing to do with her. When she applied for privileges at the women's department of a large dispensary, she was turned down and told that if she wanted to work in a dispensary, she would have to start her own. A similar fate awaited her when she applied to the infirmaries. While local medical schools slowly started admitting women, her view, having actually attended some of the teaching sessions to assess the quality, was that they were not admitting qualified students and they were not giving them adequate training. This was at a time when there were no state licensing boards, no prerequisites for medical school. Indeed, Harvard Medical School gave oral exams to get by the problem of illiteracy among its students. And postgraduate training was an option that most did not take advantage of. Elizabeth began seeing patients, gradually located physicians that would consult on her patients, and established a dispensary for women and children. From there, she incorporated, established a board of directors with prominent citizens, and then expanded to become the New York Infirmary and College for Women. By combining the infirmary with a medical school, she anticipated by decades the Johns Hopkins model of associating a medical school with a hospital. And by requiring rigorous courses prior to admission to her medical school, she was assuring that women who received degrees were more than qualified. In 1854, her sister, Emily, had graduated from medical college in Cleveland, becoming the third woman to earn an MD in the United States, and was studying in England, Scotland, and Paris, preparing to join her sister in practice. While awaiting her sister's return, Elizabeth was joined by a Polish midwife, Maria Zakrzewska, who was interested in becoming a doctor. Elizabeth dispatched her to Ohio for formal medical training before having her come back to join her at the infirmary. While in England, Elizabeth had formed a strong relationship with Florence Nightingale and came to appreciate the importance of the sanitary movement. She incorporated these principles into the care she delivered. Indeed, she hired Dr. Rebecca Cole, the second female African-American doctor in the United States, to make house calls among the tenements in New York City and teach sanitary practice. Thus she established both a dispensary and an infirmary for women as well as a women's medical school and elevated the standards for all. But she wasn't done. Back to England in 1858, where she decided to settle, she sensed that there was progress to be made in the medical education of women. While she was registered as a physician in the medical register, which was another first, she was limited in that the medical schools would not admit her for further study. She mentored Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who did gain admission and was to become the first woman to earn an MD in England, and who then went on to start the first women's medical school as well as a hospital devoted to women, the London School of Medicine for Women at the Royal Free Hospital. Another collaborator, Sophia Jex Blake, a graduate of Elizabeth's New York City Medical School, also went on to found a women's medical school in Edinburgh. Towards the latter part of her career, she was sidelined by biliary colic that forced her to leave practice and convalesce. So what are we to make of all of this? Her accomplishments were so numerous. She not only set the precedent for women getting a medical degree, but she raised the standard. She saw problems and took the initiative, but always in a personal, bottom-up manner. To her, the letter of introduction and personal relationships were paramount. She made inroads one step and one person at a time. She was smart, curious, and of independent mind. Although she determined to enter medicine as a traditionalist, this did not stop her from attending and keeping an open mind to the many of alternatives that were out there. She also was frank in her skepticism of the value of much that was practiced in her day, and vowed to apply data collection and analysis to her own cases. She had numerous friends and maintained strong relationships, including having many male supporters. Indeed, her breakthroughs were due to her ability to work with men. She did not make enemies, but rather she found ways to go around those who stood in her way, and she never thought of giving up. As unique as she was a woman of her times and had an incredible support and connections. Her sister was the third MD in the United States. Her sister-in-law was the first female minister in the United States. Her brother, Henry, helped to found the American Woman Suffrage Association and the Republican Party. And his wife, Lucy Stone, was a leader in the women's rights movement in the United States. She was close friends with Harriet Beecher Stowe in Cincinnati, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a breakthrough book in the abolitionist movement. Still, these were difficult years. She noted that ill-natured gossip and insolent anonymous letters took their toll. She noted, "These malicious stories are painful to me, for I am a woman as well as a physician, and both natures are wounded by these falsehoods. But, and get this, I'm glad that I, and not another, have to bear this pioneer work. A work of the ages cannot be hindered by individual feeling. 100 years hence, women will not be what they are now." Elizabeth Blackwell died on Tuesday, May 31, 1910, at the age of 89, at her home in Hastings, England, and is buried in Kilmun, Scotland, a place where she loved to spend holidays.